program for me because I came across the story of Tom Connor about 30 years ago, and he left a, I'm sorry, he's just got a great story. He left a great impact on me, and I'm so glad that Dr. Stebbins, we made the connection, that we could share the Joplin Tiffin story of Tom Connor and the connection, and I think you're really going to enjoy tonight's presentation. So without further ado, Dr. Stebbins.
Thank you. And Teresa didn't tell you that we had numerous emails about this, trying to work out a date. So we spent several months trying to narrow this down, and so I'm glad that it all worked out, and I'm here. So I got my doctorate at Bowling Green, so I was here about 25 years ago. And so this was a good opportunity for me to get back and see the campus and the town. I graduated with my PhD in 1995 and hadn't been back since. And so, you know, I looked on the map, oh, Tiffin, Bowling Green, that's about an hour. You know, it might be fun to go back and do that. And so I'm pleased to be able to tell you the story of Tom Connor. Some of you are already somewhat familiar with him, others maybe not. So it all started with this book that I published in February, Joplin's Connor Hotel. And this was about a 5-year project, doing the research and doing the writing. And the Connor was the most significant building in Joplin's history in southwest Missouri. And so many people have memories of the Connor Hotel. It was demolished in 1978. And if we have time toward the end, I'll get into just a little bit of history about the Connor Hotel. It was published by the History Press. It's on Amazon. But I wrote too many words. And they told me that I had to do quite a bit of cutting. And I had an entire chapter about Tom Connor. And so I thought, well, I want to keep all the crucial information about the hotel. I'll completely remove the information about Tom Connor, and I'll publish my own book about Tom Connor. And my son Brennan designed it. And so that's the focus of tonight's presentation, Tom Connor, Joplin's millionaire, Zinke. So let me give you a little bit of background about Mr. Connor. His parents were James and Catherine OHara. Tom Connor was born in County Kerry, Ireland, born on a 5-acre tenant farm. And this is County Kerry right here, the shaded area of the map of Ireland. So it's the closest county to the United States on the southeast coast. The OHconnors had 4 children. Michael, I know virtually nothing about Michael OHconnor. He just kind of slipped into history. The only thing I know is he might have died in 1854. And there was Cornelius, Mary, and Tom. So Tom was the youngest. They lived in a 3-room cottage in County Kerry. And you may think, well, that's good. They had a lot of room. Well, there were 15 people living in that 3-room cottage. There were the 6 OHconnors. There was Tom's grandmother, Tom's aunt and uncle, and their 6 children. Wow. And so during this time, Ireland was experiencing the Great Potato Famine. I think 1 million people died. 1 million people left Ireland, and Ireland lost about a quarter of its population during this 4 or 5 year period. And so James and Catherine, again, they're tenant farmers raising potatoes, they decided they needed to seek their fortune in America. Well, it's expensive to buy passage on a ship, and so they scrimped and saved for 4 years, raising the money for the 6 of them to travel to the United States. And they finally did, and in 1851, then they settled in Tiffin. I don't know why Tiffin. Would love to know, how they happened to pick this part of the United States, but nevertheless, they settled in Tiffin. Unfortunately, James died about 2 years later. So Tom is 5 years old when his father dies. And we went out to the cemetery this morning and saw the O'Connor family plot, and it's always interesting to me to see these older graves that his exact age, 54 years, 3 looks like and 3 months, which was a custom back then. And so this is a quote from Tom's favorite niece, Kate O'Connor. From the time his father was taken from him, his own independent struggle to make his own way may be dated. The business energy that characterized him as a man early manifested itself in the boy. And so I think losing his father at such a young age, and the fact that his mother then had become the primary breadwinner, and she took on a number of jobs, sewing and raising vegetables, anything she could to support the family. Now, when Tom was 13, the Civil War broke out, and Tom was determined to join up with the Seneca sharpshooters, and there are probably some of you in the audience who know a lot more about the Seneca sharpshooters and the 8th Ohio Volunteer Infantry than I do. But Tiffin Dennis, Franklin Freeman recruited 133 volunteers. Actually 134, but they wouldn't accept Tom. Tom was 13 years old and weighed 80 pounds. He was told, "You are too young, you are too small, we cannot take you." Well, as the train was departing to take the troops away for basic training, Tom managed to sneak aboard the train. And some of the soldiers hid him between their legs and between the luggage. And so he was a member of the 8th Ohio Volunteer Infantry. He became a newsboy, acquiring newspapers and selling them to the soldiers for 10 cents a copy. The 8th Ohio Volunteer Infantry was such a wonderful fighting unit. And as a newsboy, Tom went everywhere they went. In addition to selling papers, he also helped remove injured soldiers from the battlefield. And so he was right there in the thick of things many times with bullets flying around him. And the 8th Ohio Volunteer Infantry, they witnessed some of the major battles of the Civil War. Kernstown, Second Battle of Fredericksburg, Antietam, and Gettysburg. And this is a painting of the 8th Ohio fighting, probably at Pickett's charge at Gettysburg. Well, after Gettysburg and after serving 2 years, the 8th Ohio was given sort of a reprieve. They were sent to New York. They were taken off the battlefield, sent to New York to help quell draft rioting. And so that was a break for the soldiers. 2 years of intense fighting. We'll go to New York and stop this rioting. Well, obviously Tom wasn't needed to sell newspapers in New York, and so he went back home to Tiffin. And his mother was so relieved. Finally Tom is home. He's been away for 2 years. Now he'll spend the rest of his life here. He'll get a job. He'll settle down in Tiffin. Well, Tom had other ideas. He had a severe case of wanderlust, and he stayed there in Tiffin, just a couple of months, went to the bank. He had made some pretty good money selling papers during the Civil War. He withdrew all his money. He gave the teller instructions to put half of it in his mother's account, and he kept the other half. And then he and 2 buddies set out, first for St. Louis, and then they took a river boat to Kansas City. Again, Tom is born in 1847, so he's only 17 when he starts out on this journey. Well, in Kansas City, he came down with a severe case of typhoid fever. Nearly died. Spent 9 months recuperating in Kansas City. Was able to take some short excursions from his base in Kansas City. He found a kindly woman who nursed him back to health, and he gave her strict instructions: do not write my mother, because she would have come there at once. Well, while in Kansas City, he traveled just up the Missouri River to Leavenworth, Kansas. And in Leavenworth, Kansas, he met General Patrick Edward Connor, a hero of the Mexican-American War and the American Indian Wars. General Connor was also from County Kerry, Ireland, and his name had previously been O'Connor. And so that's when Tom decided to drop the O from his name. Tom O'Connor became Tom Connor. Sounded more American. After recuperating from typhoid fever, he drove a mule train across Kansas to Denver and then on to Salt Lake City. You know, that took, I think, several months. And then from Salt Lake City, he went north to Montana, to Virginia City, and did some mining, tried to strike it rich as a prospector, did various odd jobs to support himself. And then he found out you could make money in Texas running cattle up to Missouri and Kansas, and so he and a friend go to Texas and they do some cattle drives. He bought a livery stable in Seneca, Missouri, which is just south of Joplin, just probably 20 miles or so. And he soon moved the operation to Joplin. Now in Joplin, he ran a daily hack line, horse and buggy line, to a couple of neighboring towns. He also operated a saloon in Joplin. Now Joplin was founded in 1873, so it was a brand new town, a lot of opportunities. It was a wide open town, a rough place really, a lot of mining camps still. Go ahead. But somewhere along the line, he meets this woman, Melissa Wilcox, in Michigan. And again, this is another mystery. She lived in White Pigeon, Michigan. She was nearly 4 years younger than Tom, and they were married in 1874, and he moved her back to Joplin. And what they did for entertainment, they took horse and buggy rides out into the areas surrounding Joplin. And he would tell Melissa, he would point to a tract of land and he would say, there's lead and zinc under there. And he had a knack, I don't know how, but he could identify a piece of land and immediately know if there were rich deposits of zinc underneath. And so he started buying up all of this land. And here's another quote from Kate O'Connor. Swift to follow the leadings of his vision, he began to buy acre after acre of that which was universally regarded as utterly worthless land. Parcels of earth scattered in every direction from Joplin, consisting of hillsides, hilltops, untillable gullies and hollows, all considered a wild waste. He ended up buying about 6,000 acres, primarily in southwest Missouri, some in southeast Kansas. I found this quote from the Fremont newspaper. Everything Mr. Connor touched seemed to turn to gold, and he was soon the wealthiest man in Joplin. So he really had a Midas touch. It seemed like everything he touched turned to gold. And I need to tell you just a little bit about the Tri-State Mining District. The Tri-States, Missouri, Kansas, and Oklahoma. This was such a rich, contained rich deposits of lead and zinc. And for a while when they mined the lead, they didn't realize the value of the zinc and threw it away. And so Joplin's nickname is the town that Jack built. Jack is another term for lead. And there's some theories, you know, why all this lead and zinc were in the area. And the most prevalent one is that an asteroid or a meteorite hit this area thousands of years ago and left all these deposits of lead and zinc. Just a few facts about the Tri-State Mining District. More than half of the bullets fired by Allies in World War I were made of lead mined in the Tri-State District. More than half the zinc mined in the United States came from the Tri-State District. And By 1935, more than $16 billion in today's figures had been mined in the Tri-State District. So Tom Connor picked a good place to settle. And again, he had this uncanny knack at knowing which tracts to buy. Now, he himself didn't do any mining. He never swung a pick or a shovel. There was a term called grub staking miners. He would provide miners with all the equipment that they needed. And then they would go mine on his land. And if they found lead or zinc on his property, he divided the profits with them. And so he just kind of sat back in his office and let all of these miners do the work for him. And so Joplin really became a boom town of all boom towns. You know, again, it wasn't established until 1873. By 1890, it had a population of nearly 10,000. By 1900, it had grown to 26,000. That's a 162% increase in 10 years. And then by 1910, 32,000. So at this point, 1900, Joplin was the 4th largest city in the state of Missouri, behind St. Louis, Kansas City, and St. Joseph. And reporters would come to Joplin on a fairly regular basis just to see what was going on. The area was called the Klondike of the Ozarks. And reporters wanted to see all these people were making thousands and thousands of dollars. And one reporter wrote, "Hit Joplin early in the morning or you may have to sleep in the street at night." And there were 2 main hotels in Joplin. There was the Joplin Hotel on the left and the Keystone Hotel on the right. Tom Connor bought half of the Joplin Hotel in 1881. So he wasn't just mining, he diversified his interest. He owned part of a bank, he owned the Joplin Water Works, he owned this hotel, had many different business opportunities that he was involved with. So we're going to shift our focus now back to Tiffin. We've spent some time in Joplin, and now we're going to go back to Tiffin. And on the left is Mary Nolan. That's Tom's sister, 5 years older. She had 2 children, Nan, born in 1875, and Thomas Connor Nolan, named after his famous uncle, born in 1880. Don't know what happened to Mr. Nolan, Thomas Nolan. He, again, has kind of disappeared into history. You know, at the cemetery today, we saw Mary's grave, but there's no grave for her husband, Thomas. So, on the left, I think this is really a great photo. August 20th, 1890, the Nolan House. And we went by it today. It still exists. You can see some similarities. It's at 108 North Jackson. But I love how they labeled their photos. There's Thomas Connor Nolan, who would have been 10, and Nan Nolan, who would have been 14 at the time. Okay. So Thomas Connor Nolan went to Notre Dame, and he played baseball. He graduated in 1899 at the age of 19. In those days, you didn't go to college for 4 or 5 years. You only went for a year or 2. And so he graduated in 1899, and his uncle, Tom, brings him to Joplin. And I love this photo. Tom Connor on the right, Thomas Connor Nolan on the left in their Joplin office. So he, brings him to Joplin in 1899 and has him help keep track of all his business interests, all those miners that he's grub staking. Somebody has to keep accurate records. Okay. And then in June 1902, he marries a local girl, Margaret Water, who was originally from Ontario, Canada. as a wedding present, Tom Connor gave them $10,000. That's a lot of money. It's a lot of money today, but you can imagine in 1902. And where did they go on their honeymoon? Any guesses?
Tiffin.
Okay. First, they went to St. Louis to visit Tom Connor, who was in St. Louis at the time, and then they went to Tiffin, I'm sure, to visit his mother, who wasn't able to come to Joplin for the wedding. And so they had this $10,000 wedding present, and they built a nice home in Joplin. And I have a friend who now lives in that house, and she calls it the Thomas Connor Nolan House, and she's real proud of the history, and she was real excited that I did this book. Okay. Well, Tom Connor was such a generous benefactor. He gave $20,000 in 1904, 1905 to build St. Mary's Church here. And then in Joplin, he also gave $20,000 at the same time to build St. Peter's Catholic Church. He also contributed money to the hospital in Joplin. He contributed money to a home for old miners who couldn't work anymore. Anyone who asked him for a donation, he would usually give it. Very, very generous man. And there were so many millionaires in Joplin because of mining. They all built nice mansions to live in. He never did. Go ahead. Because his personal life was in tatters. I mentioned Melissa. She became insane. And he had to commit her to the St. Vincent's Institution for the Insane just outside of St. Louis in 1888. And, there wasn't much known about mental health issues in the late 1800s. From what I've read, she clearly had some mental disturbances. There were two theories why she became insane. One theory was that she was not accepted into Joplin society, by the wives of the other millionaires, because she had come from humble background. The second theory, the one that came from the family, is that she had lost a son in childbirth 3 years prior, and never got over that, and sometimes refused to believe that he had even passed away. She thought he was being kept from her, in the next room, and she could hear him crying and that type of thing. And so Mr. Connor made frequent trips to St. Louis to see her. Today, if you get in a car and drive from Joplin to St. Louis, it's 4.5 hours. I can imagine the long trip by train, that it was in the late 1800s. But he went very often. She had one of the finest rooms in this asylum, finest care. They did take her on the shopping trips into St. Louis. Supposedly she liked to buy canaries. I don't know what happened to the canaries and why she had to keep buying more and more. One would be plenty for me. Okay. So Tom was a rather lonely man, and he was actually living at the Joplin Hotel, that one building I showed you earlier. He owned half of it. He lived there. He would take walks into the city, and he would, one day he was taking a walk and he passed this convent, and he was very tired, and he stopped and asked them for a drink of water, and this 9-year-old girl, Agnes OHara, brought him a cup of cool water. And then he made a point of always stopping at the convent. She had been placed there by her father. Her mother had died a few years earlier. Her father was a janitor, unable to support her, so he placed her with these Sisters of Mercy. And then when he didn't feel like taking a walk to the convent and visiting Agnes, she would bring him milk to the Joplin Hotel from the convent cow. And he developed a great likeness of Agnes, particularly her striking eyes captivated him. And he asked the Sisters of Mercy if he could adopt her. And they asked her, would you like to be adopted by Mr. Connor? They didn't tell her that he was the richest man in Joplin. They kept that from her. And she, said yes, she would like it very much. So he adopted her, I think, in 1903 and had her added to his will. Okay? And then he also befriended the housekeeping supervisor at the Joplin Hotel, Anna Donahue. And, when you do research, you kind of, there's certain characters that you don't like and others that you gain an appreciation for. And she became one of my favorite characters. Not that she played a big role in the Tom Connor story, but he's a very lonely man. He was 25 years older than Anna, and she was of Irish descent, just like he was. And without her knowing it, he started investing some of his money in her name, buying up mining land, making business investments. And within, a year or two, had developed a nice fortune for her. Again, she didn't know any of it. And one day he approached her and said, Anna, I think you can quit your job here at the Joplin Hotel. And she broke down in tears, thinking he was firing her. And he explained, no, that's not the case at all. And he showed her what he had done. So 1906 was an exhausting year for Mr. Connor, and he still, made somewhat regular trips back to Tiffin. I think this is one of the last pictures taken of him, but you can see it was taken here in Tiffin. And I read an article from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch that he had kind of grown old ahead of his time. He was a white-haired old man, although he was still only in his 50s. But he just did so much in the year 1906. He owned half of the Joplin Hotel. He and the other owner had a falling out, and neither one wanted to kind of give in. And so they agreed that they would put the hotel up at an auction and then split the proceeds. Well, Tom bought the hotel for $104,000, which again was a staggering amount of money in 1906. Some Joplin businessmen approached him and they pledged various amounts of money, saying if he would tear down the Joplin Hotel and build a new one in its place, they would pledge money. And so the stipulation was that this new hotel had to be at least 6 stories. Joplin Hotel was 3 stories. Okay. He found the leading architects in St. Louis, met with them on one of his many trips to visit Melissa, and had countless meetings with them to go over the plans and details for the new hotel. He awarded the construction contract to a local firm. This local firm wasn't the lowest bidder. Companies from St. Louis and Chicago and Kansas City bid on it, and they submitted somewhat lower bids, but he wanted to keep the jobs local. Okay. And then he was elected to the state senate. He was a Democrat. He'd always been encouraged to run for office before, but was never that interested. But it looked like the Republicans were going to sweep the ballot Southwest Missouri in 1906, and so he finally agreed to run for the state senate, and he was elected, one of the few Democrats elected. Okay. And so they had to tear down the Joplin Hotel first, and this is a picture. They tore it down in record time, 1 week, and this is Mr. Connor right here on the front row. with it looks like a rolled up newspaper in his hand. And then they were able to start work on the new hotel. And it was completed 2 years later. And on the night it opened, the catering manager said, "This is too fine of a hotel for Joplin, it should be in Chicago." So it was 8 stories tall, about 250 rooms. It cost him $1 million. Again, 1908, $1 million. What's that today? A lot. He spent, kind of the signature feature was this lobby with the marble staircase. And that alone was $250,000. And so this was just a fabulous lobby, kind of became the primary meeting space in Joplin for the next 50 years. Anybody who was anybody could be seen in the lobby of the Connor. Okay. This is a picture of Main Street, Joplin in 1919. And of course the Connor dominates the skyline there on the left. You can see the Keystone Hotel across the street. But the Connor was so important to Joplin because it announced Joplin's arrival as a world-class city. It still had this reputation as a rough and tumble mining camp. And having this elaborate hotel that may have been the finest hotel west of the Mississippi did wonders for its image. And it was also Joplin's first skyscraper. And maybe you're saying, well, is that really a skyscraper? You know, it's 8 stories tall. It had a roof garden, which they counted as kind of the 9th story. Well, the world's first skyscraper was a home insurance building in Chicago that opened in the early 1890s. It was only 10 stories, and it was only 8 feet higher. The Connor was 130 feet tall. The home insurance building was 138. So this is just one of my favorite pictures of Joplin, showing, you know, how the Connor dominated the skyline. Okay, and we kind of got our head ahead of ourselves a little. Mr. Connor did not live to see the completion of his hotel. He died March the 29th, 1907. So he died 1 year before the Connor opened. And he wasn't even going to call it the Connor Hotel. He was thinking of calling it the Catherine Hotel in honor of his mother, or the new Joplin Hotel. But it was his heirs after he died who decided to name it Connor. So he died in San Antonio, Texas, at a sanitarium. He had gone there in January 1907 to recuperate. He had come down with a severe cold following this election to the state senate. His doctors advised him to slow down and go to a warmer climate. So he, accompanied by his niece, Kate, his favorite niece, went to San Antonio. And, you know, there were stories saying, oh, he'll be able to serve in the Senate anytime. He never actually set foot in Jefferson City, the capital, to serve. Was elected but never served. And then he developed some kind of a stomach disorder. He couldn't digest food. And so his strength just ebbed away, and then finally he died. And his niece, again, Kate, was with him. She sent a telegraph to Joplin to her brother, Jerry, you know, saying, get Agnes and meet us in Tiffin. And so they, everybody took the train. Kate accompanied the body to Tiffin. And the body was brought to the home of his sister, Mary Nolan, the house I showed you earlier. Okay. So, a lot of people from Joplin came to the funeral. Anna Donahue came to the funeral. And she became reacquainted with this young man, Alex McCartan, who ran the McCartan grocery store. Alex was a member of St. Mary's Church, and he was one of 6 pallbearers. So I imagine that they recruited pallbearers from the congregation. And Alex was a big, strapping man, and so he volunteered to be a pallbearer. And now, she said later they had become reacquainted at the funeral, so they must have met earlier. And I'm going to speculate that she and Tom Connor went to Tiffin at some point together, maybe, where she met Alex. But anyway, they were married 5 months after the funeral, nearly 5 months. They were married in Joplin. And we were talking at lunch today, but I guess this was more of a custom then. They were married at 6 a.m. in the morning at St. Peter's Catholic Church. Her sister had a wedding breakfast for them at 8, and then they were on the 9 o'clock train headed back to Tiffin. And I guess he can only take 2 days off from the grocery store. Had to rush back. But she was able to buy a nice home here in Tiffin that's still occupied by the McCartan family. Okay. And then this is an interesting case too. William Schwartz was from Fremont. He was the assistant undertaker for Tom Connor's funeral. And Nan is the another niece. They eloped, and I just wanted to read you a passage about the elopement here. It was somewhat controversial. According to most accounts, the couple obtained a marriage license at 5 p.m. and intended to board the 5:40 train out of Tiffin bound for Dearborn, Michigan, where they would be married by a priest who was a friend of Schwartz. Nan's friends who opposed the marriage, perhaps suspecting that the undertaker was more interested in her inheritance, got wind of the plan and met the couple at the Tiffin depot. They kidnapped Schwartz, carrying him away from the depot, and Nan headed northward alone. He managed to escape 3 hours later and took an electric car to Toledo, where he caught up with the bride. They were married at the Sacred Heart Parish in Dearborn, and then went to Joplin for their honeymoon. Nan's sister-in-law, Margaret Nolan, insisted to a Joplin News-Herald reporter that the entire story had been fabricated by the press. Quote, "There was no elopement, as was reported here," she said. "They were quietly married, but their engagement had been announced a long time. I knew it last Christmas. Many in Tiffin knew they were to be married, but did not know the date. They were married by a priest who is a cousin of Mr. Schwartz, and went away in order to be married by him. They had been acquainted from childhood, and did not meet at Mr. Connor's funeral, although Mr. Schwartz was there as an assistant undertaker." But the press had a field day with the story. Okay, other marriages not directly related to the funeral. Tom's favorite niece married George Chadsey of St. Louis on June 18, 1910 in Tiffin. They met during the construction of the Connor Hotel. He owned a weather stripping company in St. Louis and was there weather stripping the Connor. And then Agnes married a Charles J. Schmidt on June 18, 1913 in Tiffin. So just what was so fascinating to me was the constant going back and forth of people from Joplin to Tiffin and vice versa.
So were they coming back because the parents were here? I mean, and they were gone by that time, but I mean, they had so many ties?
Yeah.
Is that why?
That's my summary.
That's amazing.
Okay. So after Tom died, there was a great fight over his estate. Melissa had 4 sisters and a nephew, and they suddenly appear on the scene demanding money. A Jasper County judge had ruled in, Joplin's in Jasper County, a Jasper County judge had ruled in 1910 that Melissa was not entitled to half of Tom's estate. Her relatives appealed this to the Missouri Supreme Court, which upheld the Jasper County decision in 1913. And these are some of the summary statements from the Missouri Supreme Court in their decision to uphold the earlier Jasper County decision. Of course, Melissa's sisters had only a mercenary interest in her. You know, I don't think they had ever come to visit her in the insane asylum. And then they quickly disappeared after they didn't produce any money. In his will, he took great care of her. He gave her, in his will, $100,000 in case she ever recovered, and then $150 per month spending money, so she could go to St. Louis on these shopping excursions. She died in 1928, so you know, she spent the last 40 years of her life in this institution, and then was brought to Tiffin to be married next to Tom. So the Connor heirs each received 1/6 of his estate, and here's just a, in 1914, after this Supreme Court decision, the 6 of them formed the Connor Investment Company to manage the hotel and the other mining properties and businesses that Tom Connor had owned. Tom Connor Nolan died at the age of 39 on a trip to Kansas City of influenza pneumonia. Jerry OConnor, the son of Cornelius, died in 1923. Big Jerry OConnor, and let me tell you, this was so confusing with these 2 nephews having the same name. They were both Jeremiah OConnor, both were called Jerry. I finally saw a reference that the one that lived in Tiffin was called Big Jerry. And I thought, okay, that's how I can differentiate them. Okay. Agnes Schmidt, she only lived to be 40, dying of a rare blood disorder, but she did have 4 children. Nolan Schwartz died in 1958, and one more. And Kate also died in 1958. So those were the 6 heirs. And I want to tell you a little bit about Ralph Nolan, the son of Thomas Connor Nolan. He graduated from Notre Dame in 1928, took flying lessons at Notre Dame, and became a licensed pilot. He made a record flight from Joplin to Fremont in 1928, leaving at 7:15 and arriving at 3:30. And why did he go to Fremont? To visit his aunt. His Aunt Nan lived in Fremont. And I should have mentioned that Nan, who married Will Schwartz, the undertaker, he only lived 10 years and died at the age of 35. So she was a widow for a long time. Until her death in 1958. He managed the Joplin Municipal Airport, was president of the Connor Investment Company for a long time until his death in 1971. He had 2 sons, Thomas Connor Nolan and J. Keith Nolan. Thomas Connor Nolan had 4 children. J. Keith Nolan had 2. So those are the only descendants still living, Ralph's grandchildren, okay? And I was fortunate to meet a daughter of Thomas Connor Nolan, and she's the one who supplied all of these photos that made up my presentation that I used in the book. She lives in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And so contacted her out of the blue, asking for photos, and she was very suspicious. Well, who is this guy? And she probably thought I was trying to still get some of that Connor money, but there's still some of it left. Thomas Connor Nolan died in 2008, but still has 4 children surviving. There is now a Thomas Connor Nolan IV. I think the 4th was born in 1983. J. Keith Nolan is an attorney in Lakeville, Connecticut, but he's 85. I've been in touch with him, and he's helped me some with the family history. Okay. And so I did some summary slides. So those going from Tiffin to Joplin, Tom Connor, Thomas Connor Nolan, Jerry OConnor. He also received a $10,000 wedding present when he got married in 1902. And so these heirs would join Jerry in Joplin for annual meetings of the Connor Investment Company. Okay. Now this is kind of funny. I told you my confusion. The 2 Jerry OConnors, Tiffin kept one, and they sent one to Joplin. And I think you made the right choice in keeping Big Jerry and sending the other Jerry to Joplin. He blocked construction of an annex to the Connor Hotel in 1916 as he didn't want the expense or the risk. He entered into an agreement with his sister Kate in 1907 to pay $25 per month to Kate to help take care of their mother in St. Louis. Well, he made only 2 monthly payments. That's why I call him a skinflint, a cheapskate. And so she eventually sues her brother. I couldn't believe that. She takes her brother to court, sues him for $4,650 that he hadn't paid her for support of their mother. Well, he figured out a way where he didn't have to pay. Oh, I think, is there going? Well, I guess this got left off, but he died in 1923. So he got out of paying. So that's a picture of him. And then next slide is Big Jerry. And he did all right for himself. Didn't care much for his cousin, though. The 2 Jerrys had a lot of disagreements. Okay. And then from Joplin to Tiffin, we sent you Agnes OHara and Connor Schmidt. And I found this a little interesting. Her father, who allowed her to be adopted by Tom Connor, well, once he discovers that she's in the money, then he kind of resurfaces in her life, and he moves to Tiffin. And 2 of her brothers move close to Tiffin, Green Springs and Crestline. So, and then one more. And of course, we sent you Anna. So it's pretty well balanced out, I think. Although I think Joplin probably fared a little better in getting Tom Connor. But still, these are not insignificant people that we sent you. And now, just briefly on the Connor Hotel. This is a picture from the early 40s. They did build an annex to the hotel in 1928, which gave it 400 rooms. It had 5 restaurants. It became a major convention hotel. Joplin became a leading convention city. National and regional and state conventions. I have a chapter in my book about all the infamous and famous people who stayed here. Joe Palmer was a member of Bonnie and Clyde's gang, and Clyde Barrow himself dropped off Joe Palmer at the Connor Hotel in 1934. Joe Palmer left the next day in a hurry. I don't know why. You can probably guess, but he was soon, Clyde had broken him out of a penitentiary in Texas, and he was soon recaptured and sent back to the penitentiary. And while he was in the penitentiary, he wrote a letter to the manager of the Connor Hotel saying he'd left in such a hurry that he left his suitcase, and could the Connor send him his suitcase to the Texas penitentiary. Manager of the Connor wrote back and said, "You can have your suitcase when you pay your bill." And so he never did get his suitcase back, and then he was executed less than a year later. And then Pretty Boy Floyd, who was from Oklahoma, not terribly far from Joplin, apparently stayed there many times. When we were in Bowling Green earlier this week, they have an old hotel called the Milliken, and there was a story that said Pretty Boy Floyd had stayed there too. And so I guess that disappointed me a little, that he must have gone all over Pretty Boy Floyd. He was public enemy #1, according to J. Edgar Hoover. And then we did have a better class of customers. Harry Truman. I found a letter written on Connor Hotel stationery and mailed in a Connor Hotel envelope to his wife, Bess, in 1924. Harry Truman stayed there multiple times as a Missouri U.S. Senator. And then on the right, this picture was taken at breakfast on August the 31st, 1944. Harry Truman was going to accept the vice presidential nomination. Harry Truman was born in Lamar, Missouri, about 40 miles north of Joplin. And the Democratic Party organizers decided that he should officially accept the nomination for vice president in his hometown of Lamar. Well, Lamar was too small to host all the dignitaries, and so the Connor Hotel was where everybody stayed. And so 10 of the leading Democratic senators came. And so for you old-timers, it's Senator Tom Connally from Texas on the left, and Senator Carl Hatch from New Mexico on the right. So then later in the day, they traveled up to Lamar, where Truman officially accepted the vice presidential nomination. Okay. Eleanor Roosevelt stayed there. Just anybody who was anybody stayed at the Connor. Reagan didn't stay there, but he attended the reception there. Richard Nixon didn't stay there, but did spend some time there. And just kind of a lengthy list of famous people. And then the end came for the Connor, primarily because Interstate 44 opened in the late 50s. This kind of replaced Route 66, which also went through Joplin. But in 1957, they completed I-44 to the Missouri-Oklahoma line, and then they extended it 10 miles to Joplin. And then there was a much closer exit. There's a main strip street in Joplin called Rangeline Road that's very close to I-44, and that's where all of these new motels sprang up. Mickey Mantle, who played minor league baseball in Joplin, in 1957 opened a Holiday Inn right off the interstate, and other motels followed suit. And the travelers on I-44 wanted these modern amenities. They wanted to be able to park right next to their room. They wanted a swimming pool. The Connor was this aging hotel in downtown Joplin, and no one wanted to drive all the way there. Anybody hear the actor Bob Cummings? He and Dennis Weaver are Joplin's two most famous actors. Bob Cummings opened a motor lodge in 1962, again on Rangeline. And so the Connor just couldn't compete and closed as a hotel in 1969. Okay. So this is what the Connor looked like in 1978, just prior to demolition. The city had decided to build a new public library. There was still a prime location in downtown Joplin, and they were going to use explosives and bring the hotel down. And so it's boarded up there. It's just a few days before demolition. And it collapsed prematurely. It collapsed 24 hours before demolition.
Wow.
One more. And 3 workers were trapped in the rubble. In fact, it took the better part of the day to figure out exactly how many people were trapped. It happened on a Saturday, and they didn't have clear records who was supposed to be working that day. First they thought 5, and they ended up realizing that 3 workers had been trapped inside the rubble. And so Joplin became the focus of national attention for 5 days in November of 1978 as they struggled to remove all this rubble to try to get these workers out. They had no idea if they were still alive. Okay. And they brought in a German Shepherd from St. Louis who could sniff out human flesh. And the dog spent a couple of days, going through the rubble. And the dog was interested in this one particular spot, and so that's where they focused their digging. And after 77 hours, they discovered that one of the workers was still alive, Alfred Summers. And then it took another 5 hours to actually raise him up. They had to be very careful not to cause more damage. And so he, literally had been buried alive for 77 hours. And then the next day, they found the bodies of the other 2 workers. And there we go.